Welcome to Restoring Education in America with Priscilla Rahn. She's a master educator and author, leading the conversation to restore the American mind through wisdom, virtue, and truth.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to Restoring Education in America. I'm your host, Priscilla Rahn, and I am so thrilled that you've decided to join the conversation today. We are right in the middle of school choice time. Parents are looking for great options for their children, and I want to tell you about a new school that's opening this fall in Centennial. It's Excalibur Classical Academy, and their mission and vision is restoring America's heritage by developing servant leaders who are keepers and defenders of the principles of freedom for which our founding fathers pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. So if you have a young child that's starting kindergarten through third grade, open enrollment is going on right now, and they would be very happy to give you a tour and talk a little bit more about their curriculum. And if you're a teacher looking for a great environment to teach in, please go to their website to submit your resume. Well, something that's really critical when it comes to learning is making sure your children are on track for greatness. And so I'm going to bring my next guest to the stage who's going to talk all about assessments. Welcome, Mr. Trent Kramer. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It is so great to have this conversation with you. And for my listeners who can't see, you have a wonderful library.
I do, yeah.
I'm trying to keep up with you.
I'm cheating a little bit because some of these books are my wife's too. So that, I'm just making myself look better than I am.
Well, listen, before we get too far into the conversation, I'm going to share a little bit of your bio with our listeners. Trent Kramer is Director of Charter School Partnerships at Classical Learning Test, CLT, which provides academic assessments for grades 3 through 12 that evaluate reading, grammar, writing, and mathematics. A graduate of Hillsdale College, his work is rooted in a commitment to great books, moral philosophy, and the intellectual traditions that have long shaped Western education. Before launching CLT, Kramer served as the founding headmaster of Ascent Classical Academy of Northern Colorado, where he helped build a school grounded in time-tested educational principles. Through CLT, he now leads a growing national movement to align assessment with classical learning, expanding opportunities for students, schools, and colleges seeking meaningful alternatives to conventional standardized testing. But your most important job is husband and dad.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. That's great. Yeah.
So we always like to ground my show on, we have all of these jobs, but our most important job is our family. And so take us all the way back when I was reading your bio about your work in education. What sparked your love for education?
Yeah, it's easy, and I can point to a particular time in my life, maybe a particular year in my life. I grew up in a small town in Michigan, and it was all about sports, and that was my life. I wanted to be a professional football player. Little did I know that was never going to happen, but I wanted to play college football, and I ended up accidentally falling into a scholarship to play at this little school that I'd never heard of called Hillsdale College. And so my desire to go to Hillsdale College was to play sports. I didn't even realize what the institution was, which I see it just as a massive blessing in my life that I ended up there, because I really went to a school that I didn't really read books. I didn't understand how to write. I didn't see the value in things like mathematics. And so I ended up going there and falling on my face. The first book I had to read was Nicomachean Ethics. And I was like, I don't know what this guy's saying. And so I really didn't get it. And my freshman year was really hard. I worked hard and I didn't really like it. But I saw all my friends that had been in classical schools their entire career that were just eating this up, and they were loving it. And there was joy in their learning. And I was like, I don't know why they're loving this so much. Well, I didn't know what they had, but I knew I wanted it. And so even though I thought about not coming back my sophomore year, I came back my sophomore year to Hillsdale, and I started really settling into the tradition. and seeing the value, not just from an intellectual perspective, but to the fruitfulness that it brings to our lives. The human element of us desiring to know things and to do that within community just blew my mind. And I fell in love with that. It also changed not only my outlook on my life, but my faith. And so that was a really big part of it as well. And I remember talking to a professor of mine, Dr. Blackstock, about this. And I said, hey, I don't know what I want to do with my life. I think I want to maybe go into ministry, or maybe I want to go and do something in athletics. And I said, but man, I wish someone would have exposed me to classical education earlier. I wish someone would have done that. And he said, well, it sounds like maybe you should do that. And so I will forever be grateful of Dr. Blackstock at Hillsdale College of saying, hey, maybe this is what you're meant to do. And so I fell in love with teaching. I fell in love with the education movement, the education reform that was happening in the United States at the time. And so I threw myself into teaching, and the rest is history, as they say. I can't get away from it.
So what subject did you teach?
So I taught at a little charter school down in Arizona to start, and I started teaching Western Civ and American history. And then that expanded into, in my research in classical ed, I started teaching philosophy. I really loved teaching moral and political philosophy. And so I stayed mostly in that realm. And then when I became a headmaster in our first year, we were a K-6, and I did some teaching of third grade mathematics, and I loved it. That was one of my favorite classes I've ever taught, really. So I've taught a little bit of grammar school mathematics, mostly the humanities in middle school and high school, all the way up through senior capstone.
Okay, so I'm like you. I grew up in public education.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in public education as an educator, as a principal, 32 years. I'm retiring this year. About a couple of years ago, I got introduced to classical education. And like you, I keep saying, I got here as fast as I could. Where's this been all my life?
Yeah.
And I don't think people really understand how compelling and how exciting classical curriculum is once you start understanding how it works, how the sausage is made. And it's not stuffy. I was doing a parent information session on Excalibur the other day, and they said, well, what does a day look like? Because they want to bring their kindergartner. Are you going to have playtime? And I said, oh, yes, everything is centered around play. And they said, yeah, because I just imagine classical education where kids are sitting at a desk in rows and their hands are folded and they can never move. And that's what I think people think about when they think about a classical education.
Yeah.
Can you demystify what classical education is, and what is classical education in your words?
So to me, classical education is the means of which, there's kind of two parts, the means of which we become more fully human. So it is teaching us the necessary skills, habits, and virtues upon which independent and joyful lives are built. And so all of the things we need to live fully flourishing human lives is a part of classical ed. The other part of it is allowing us to see and find joy in the world around us, because there's kind of two sides of this. There's the human element we're looking at internally, right? Maybe a little late navel gazing that's appropriate at this age, right? Who are we? Who am I? But then also being able to see the joy and the beauty around us in the world. And so that's where, even when you are sitting in a line in a row and you're learning something, there is excitement and joy and flourishing. I do think that there is some elements of classical education out there that have given classical ed a bad rap because they are a little bit boring, or they're all about rigor. And I've heard it from a lot of people now. No, classical ed should be about vigor. There might be hard work. There is hard work that and we're made for hard work, but there's also this immense joy that comes with that. And so we talked a lot at Northern Colorado about the virtue of wonder. And the virtue of wonder was the pinnacle virtue for us because it encompassed both of those things. There is this idea that we deeply as human beings want to know, and we're made to know, and we're made to ask questions, right? Your kindergartners are going to want to ask you every question they possibly can because they're just so excited to know. And the other part of it is that because we are made to come to know, there is joy in that process. And so that delight in that process is a beautiful, wonderful. So classical ed is that idea of coming to be more human and being able to see the world around you in the way that you ought to. And so you'll notice I didn't say anything about jobs. That is something that I think is why education right now is at such a stale point, is that we have set such a low bar for kids. We want them to go to school, do well on tests, to get a good job, to make money. Well, if that's all there is to life, like, I don't blame kids for not really wanting to spend a lot of time at school. But if we can teach them in the ways that they can live lives that are flourishing in people, that is what classical ed is about. And then there is one other element, and I have to give a nod to G.K. Chesterton. I love this quote, that education is the transmission of culture from one generation to the other. And so there is this also generational transmission of culture that goes along with classical ed that I think that we've lost a lot in our modern education system as well. And so there's an element of that being the coming to know your place in the world a little bit as far as the culture that you are now inheriting. And then at some point in time, have the legacy of transmitting on to the next generation.
Wow, very articulate, Mr. Kramer. So you attended Hillsdale College. We know Hillsdale to be this amazing institution that is putting out all this wonderful content. In fact, every time I open my social media, there's an ad that says free course, free course. They just want everybody to experience this type of learning. And I love that they have an abundance mentality about their knowledge, and they are not tight-fisted. And that's one of our 10 core values at Excalibur, is that abundance mentality. So for people who might ask, okay, is this a Christian education? Is this a secular education? Is this a classical education? But being a man of faith, how do you explain the faith element in classical education?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the way that you can go about this is that classical ed is seeking to help us understand that there are objective truths in the world. And so in a religious setting, the truth is going to be based on a faith in God, right? And that God's creation and all of that. We'll set that aside for now. I obviously came from, and most of the schools that I currently work with in my job are from a secular side, because we're a charter school, and a public charter school has to be very mindful of the fact that we cannot proselytize to kids, because that would be in a lot of cases illegal. And so how do we then justify this idea that we're teaching virtue and we're teaching morality without a faith element? So we can look at the classical tradition and see that there were plenty of people that would not be, considered a religious person, that still delighted in and sought after these things that were maybe under nature, right? We think of the Western tradition, and later on in the Enlightenment, you get these phrases of the laws of nature and in nature's God. Maybe there's a deistic view that can still align with this idea of classical ed without having to go on the faith route. That being said, those of us that are people of faith believe that if we seek truth, we will find it. And ultimately, we're going to find it in the one who made truth, or is truth. And so again, that's where charter schools that get into this route have to be careful, because we're not saying you have to be a Christian, or that we're going to make your kids Christian by being in a classical school. It's not the case. But we are hopefully getting them to become seekers of truth, lovers of truth, and those who are good and love what they should love. And so, that's where a lot of conversations and nuance can come in when you are in the secular setting. On the religious side of things, if you're in a private Christian school, you get to go a step further and say, well, truth has a name, right? And so we can come to know that person. And so there's a lot of elements that can flow from that, maybe whereas in a secular setting, your little ones are learning poetry and songs and things like that. And especially a lot of our a traditional American kind of classics, but maybe in a religious class, you're learning hymns, or you're memorizing scripture, and recitations are going to be scripture based. So it will look a little different, even though the schools will feel very similar, if that makes sense.
Wow, another excellent explanation. It's no wonder that you were a headmaster and now you are working at a classic learning test. Okay, so you and I met at Fort Collins at our mutual friend, Congressman Bob Schaefer, who I adore. Liberty Common is the top school in Colorado, and you were there at your booth talking about assessments.
Yep.
And so talk about, how do you test classical learning, all of these beautiful, virtuous things that you're talking about?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit just about the founding of the CLT. Jeremy Tate, who's the founder of CLT, started CLT about 10 years ago. And the whole frustration that he had is he was in schools teaching students, and there was just this kind of pragmatism, right? They're taking classes so that they can get things, and then he's trying to teach in a classical manner, or even he was in a Catholic school, so from the Catholic tradition, and these things just weren't they weren't aligning, right? And so he starts going, well, when it comes to assessments, and he was doing some SAT prep on the side as a job, and he's like, well, the SAT is not really about growing in knowledge and virtue. It's about doing the things necessary to pass a test to get a score. And so it wasn't really aligning really well. So he goes, well, there's got to be an alternative. So obviously the other alternative people think of is the ACT. And his finding of that is, well, they're kind of the same. They're coming at it from a little bit different angles. The overall intention of the test is the same. And so alongside this happening, you see this massive increase in the education reform, especially in the classical movement, where people are spending all of this time on, their curriculum and their pedagogy and the philosophy of their school and their school culture and uniforms and all these things they're spending all this time and intentionality on. And then when it comes to assessments, they're just doing what everyone else does. Well, that doesn't kind of make sense. Well, so he's like, well, maybe someone should start a new test. And the first response he got was, well, I think that's illegal. In some cases, it's right. There's a lot of assessments that are written into law that schools have to take, even that homeschoolers have to take in certain states. And so what he found is that assessments are driving a lot of what we are doing in education, right? You said it during your intro, like, well, how do we know that our kids are on track? How do we know what they know, right? We as teachers, good teachers, are assessing our kids constantly, right? A lot of those are informal, or maybe we're writing a formal unit test. But on this idea of, especially when it comes to baseline skills and aptitude, having a kind of nationally normed representation of that is kind of important. But no one did one that was maybe worthy of the movement that we're talking about. And so Jeremy decided, well, he was just going to do it. And over the last 10 years, they've been trying to do that. Now you asked, how do we assess them classically? Well, I think first off, I want to say that there's a little bit different in the philosophy. A lot of assessments say that they are the end all be all. And a lot of schools spend a lot of time on their data and focusing on, well, what are our student outcomes? And that's the whole of it, right? The student is then boiled down to a number. We would say that we are a tool in the school's belt of assessing, okay, this is where a student is on their aptitude or their lexile score, or how's their mathematical reasoning. All of those things come together to try to point a student or a teacher towards where is a student at in comparison to other students in similar schools. Now, again, that's not the end all be all. And what we do, and this is a lot of my job, is working with schools on, okay, well, what does this mean? And then how can we make this actionable based on what you know about the child as a human being, right? So our philosophy of testing is different. The other thing that we do a little bit differently is we try to make sure that the skills that would be needed for a student to access some of the texts that we're talking about in this tradition that they want to read eventually, right? We want every kid to read Plato's Republic. Well, they kind of have to understand text analysis. They kind of have to be able to dive into and pull apart different parts of speech and things like that. And so we build our tests to make sure that there's kind of that general progression of skills that students should be able to meet. The other thing that we do on that front, and you look at every test out there, there's some reading component where they're judging the grammar, or they're judging, how well is the comprehension of the student. And they're reading things that are kind of just not really great to read. I give this example a lot. I had an SAT, and I have a vivid memory of reading the instructions to a refrigerator on the SAT. Why am I reading this? Why am I spending time? Why would we not put good, worthy things in front of students when they're taking tests? So we spend a lot of time and intentionality on putting works of the tradition in front of students in this position. So instead of a kid reading, a technical report for their reading comprehension, let's let them read Charlotte's Web. Let's let them read a passage of Mark Twain. Let's let them read a section of Einstein's reports on one of his experiments. So something that's actually worthy of their time. So we spend a lot of time on that front. And on the math side, this is another kind of distinct that we have. A lot of math assessments are boiling down to whether or not a student can appropriately plug things into a calculator to do the computation for them. We don't allow calculators on our tests. We want students to really show that they can be the one that's driving the thought process on the mathematical side of things. So we just really look at things with a holistically different philosophy. I do think that if someone picked up one of our tests and looked at it, they might, unless they dive into it, they might just go, well, this kind of looks the same. It looks like a test. Well, because it is. It is a test. But when you start to dig a little bit deeper into it, you'll see that there are really fundamental differences in what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to do.
So there are some great works, some classics that are common amongst all classical schools. You mentioned like Charlotte's Web.
Right.
That's one we know that is a grade appropriate, I
Sure.
believe, for second grade, third grade, somewhere around there.
Yep.
I think.
Yeah. A bunch of schools kind of put it somewhere different, but yeah, somewhere in the
Right.
earlier grammar. Yeah.
Somewhere in the early grammar years. So if someone were to hire you to be their testing company, do you give them a list of books that they know will be tested? Because it's I'm talking about teaching to the test a little bit,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I think when educators think about an assessment, they backwards plan and they go, okay, what is it that they're going to be tested on? And I'm going to make sure my students know this. Is it like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that the teaching the testing is a good thing to point out, because a lot of schools like ours, and I remember saying it for years, well, I'm not going to teach you the test. I mean, I would hope you're not fully teaching the test, but especially, at least in the charter world, especially the state test, if you don't test well, you don't exist as a school. So there is an element where you have to at least know what's on the test, and you probably will maybe adjust things because of the way the test is. And so you have to be careful of that. I will say that we as a company, we have a content brief, and it's pretty easy for our schools to see it, and we give that out to our schools. And we kind of have the general skills that we're trying to assess. We, as much as possible, though, try to be curriculum neutral. We don't want to be a test that you have to change your curriculum to do well on our test. Now, I do think that students that are going to go to a school like yours that you're starting, and we're talking about the Charlotte's Web, they're going to be more familiar with those texts. And typically schools that teach those texts also are going to expose them to many similar texts. And so there's at least familiarity with the type of text. We do have a book list, a Lexiled book list that our partner schools have helped us kind of develop, that we'd love to share as a resource, but we would never say that you have to do a certain math curriculum to do well on our test, or you have to read these books to do well on our test. And the way that the test is designed is so that it is really that skills base, right? And so as long as you're fulfilling those skills, you're going to be in a good situation. So I hope that answered your question.
Absolutely, because I think the point I was trying to lead you to, and you got there, that these skills are transferable. It really doesn't matter what the text is. If you're teaching this thought process in this way of, like the Socratic method, we're going to read, we're going to discuss, we're going to write. And if you do that multiple times, then it becomes second nature to be able to dissect and explain concepts and behaviors from the text. And when I was at the Festival of Ideas, I sat in on a math lecture and I didn't know what I was going to hear. And I was blown away at how this math teacher explained how to find truth in math, because that just dispels this whole thing about, this new math, right? And 2 + 2 doesn't necessarily mean it's 4. And it's like, no, let's get to the truth. And so it was really exciting and I thought, if I was taught math like this, I probably would have been a whole lot better at math and understanding number sense and thinking about math. So instead of just rote, stuff. So.
And you would have delighted in it more. I was actually in that same talk because that was my dean of students, David Yu, who I adore. And the whole point that he was talking about, and this is a really important thing about classical ed that I think that we miss sometimes, is even in math, we're teaching them not necessarily just the difference between what is correct and what is incorrect, or right and wrong, but what is right and almost right. And I think that we live in a world of nuance, and there's often this idea that if we just teach them the difference between right and wrong only, or the correct and incorrect, we're often going to miss a lot of that in between. That is a part of the nuance of the life of us as human beings. And so, yeah, a big fan of David Yu up there in Windsor, Colorado.
So, Trent, with your test, there's 2 ways that a student can test. They can do it online, or they can do good old-fashioned paper and pencil. Talk about the 2 different forms of testing.
Yeah, so we really have a rooted base of families that are homeschool families or some of these private schools, and even some of these public schools that we've been working with for a long time that really love paper-based testing, which especially in the classical world that you're coming from, paper and pencil is what they do all the time. We maybe are not entirely Luddites, but we're pretty low tech. And there's a reason for that. I think the ability for us to offer these assessments in a static form that are paper and pencil is a really, really good thing. And it's something that's dying out in the testing world, which is really, really sad to me. But we do also have online options. I know in the state of Colorado, all of the state testing and many of the assessments have to be done on computer. And so for our public school partners, they're starting to move to computers just because they're kind of being forced to. And so we still want to offer them as seamless of a transition into that, where students they're not being assessed on how well they can figure out a computer program, but being assessed on what they know. And so we try to design our online tests to be as straightforward and simple as possible, so that students are not, again, being a test on something that is a technical knowledge rather than an actual understanding and growth.
So your company is pretty broad. You work specifically with charter schools. You have another department that works with private Christian schools. Can you talk a little bit about the diversity in your company? And because, like you said, homeschool parents, and I think people want to know what that support would look like.
Yeah, so we have broken up. Our partnership directors are kind of broken up by types of school. So we have everything from homeschool. You talked about classical Christian. We have a Christian lane that maybe it's a not classically oriented school. In that we have a lot of Catholic partners. So we have a Catholic partnership, and all of our people that are in these partnership roles have been in the education world and have sat in your seat as a head of school or as an academic dean or an assistant principal. And so we've done this type of assessments on our own and understand how to support schools, not only in just, hey, can we get you to take the test, but how do you actually make this actionable in a way that's worth the time that you're taking to take the test, right? We never want to take time away from the classroom. So if we're going to do that, let's make it really, really worth their while and give us some insights. And so we have a lot of support mechanisms around the actual educational side of things. We have a whole operations wing to support families if they're doing it at home versus someone doing it at school. So we have a schools team. But yeah, the diversity of who we work with, really, we are touching every aspect of the education world right now, and increasingly seeing a large growth in our public school partnerships. And we're also fighting that true school choice needs to come with assessment choice.
Well, Trent, tell everybody your website if they would like to learn more about classic learning tests.
Yeah, so if you want to come onto our website, there's a ton of more information, everything from things about our tests to things that, the colleges that we partner with, resources for test prep. If you want to go down that route, you can go to cltexam.com and kind of navigate on there. There's everything from our story to those resources that I just mentioned. So yeah, hope your listeners get a chance to take a look at it. And if it's a benefit to them in what they're doing, whether it's in a school or at home, we're happy to help with that.
Well, I poked around the website and I saw all of the amazing educators that you mentioned, from higher ed all the way down to kindergarten, and so impressive, all of the people that have helped you guys develop your exam. And so I would encourage educators and parents to go and look at your website. So thank you so much for your time today, Trent. And I'm excited to be working with you with Excalibur. And to my listeners, thanks for tuning in. And remember, educating the mind without the heart is no education. So seek wisdom, cultivate virtue, and speak truth.
Thanks for tuning in to Restoring Education in America with Priscilla Rahn. Visit PriscillaRahn.com to connect or learn how you can sponsor future episodes to keep this message of faith, freedom, and education on the air.